Hi, everyone. I need to start with a warning that there's a bit of politics in this talk, because how can there not be? How can you talk about ethics and even design without having some political implications, I suppose, for it? What I hope is that even if you disagree with the conclusions that I come to, at least you might respect the questions that I ask and ponder them for yourself. I think it's time for our profession to start taking ethics seriously, but it's a difficult topic to introduce. I think there are two main reasons for this. One is just the history of ethics. You think about ethics and you think about Aristotle or Kant or Rousseau, these ancient luminaries. I think this would be a really terrible talk if I strolled through the developmental history of ethics. Because ethics for me isn't about that dusty history. It's about the fundamental choices that we make every day. It's vital and it's a current topic. It's really nothing less than a pledge to take our moral choices and, by extension, life itself seriously. The second problem I have with this topic is there is no immediate gratification with this. Ethics is a very invisible and abstract topic. There aren't any universal answers. So another thing that I'm not going to be able to do in this talk is to say, here's some definitive guidance. I can't give examples and say, look at this is ethically correct. It doesn't work that way. Instead, what I plan to do is dive into a couple of areas that I think deserve deeper ethical consideration. And instead of providing answers, I'll pose some questions. And hopefully you can ponder those and perhaps, maybe down the line, change your own behaviors according to the answers that you yourselves come to. There's an idea in ethics that crops up a fair bit, a good entry point to ethical discussion, which is the idea of playing God. Usually when we talk about playing God, what we mean is where technology intervenes in a pattern of life. We normally talk about things like conception and genetics there. But we can abstract that. We can say, really, it's anywhere where technology interferes with the natural order of things, what otherwise would have happened without us intervening. So a couple of examples of this. One fairly straightforward one, I suppose, or fairly clear-cut one, is genetically modifying a fetus to select desirable traits. Or breeding dogs for similar reasons, selectively breeding dogs who we know are going to have genetic compatibility and breed the traits that we think are desirable. But there are some applications that are perhaps less clear-cut. How about medicine? Medicines of the sort that made sure that I didn't die from asthma when I was a small child. What if I'm a designer and I create a lightning rod and I put it up by a soccer pitch, which means that during an electrical storm, the players don't actually get hit by the lightning? What if I design a table that I put a vase on and by doing so, the vase doesn't fall and shatter on the ground? Now, I have intervened in the natural outcome of things. The products we make intervene in our environments. That's why we make them. They change outcomes. So I don't think it's too far a leap to say that in essence, design is, in a way, the act of playing God. So the ethical challenges that we associate with this idea of playing God are often design challenges. Physical space is shaped by councils, planners, architects. They create the destinations, they create the route options, so they create airports and shopping malls, they create the routes, the highways, the footpaths, the transport options between those things. Now, in physical space, there is a strong democratic influence. There are things like planning approval processes. There are laws about accessibility for people with disabilities and so on. Generally, users have a strong voice, have a strong ability to speak up with physical space issues, be that direct consultation of residents, for instance, or by indirect protest, or even the ballot box. You can always vote out someone who takes you in a direction you don't think is positive for your environment. In digital space, we have quite a few of those similarities. We have those destinations. We have sites, we have social networks, we have apps, and so on. We also have transport options, route options, that take us to and from those destinations. We have browsers, we have app stores. And there's a strong case for saying that when it comes to digital space, we inhabit it, we live in it, just as much as we live in physical space. And I'd wager that pretty much everyone in this room spends longer on their favorite social networking destination than they do, say, in their local shopping center. But digital space is largely under private control. as it stands at the moment. It's companies, it's corporations who make these spaces. They dictate, largely, how those spaces can and should be used. They set the rules for acceptable behavior in those spaces. What that means is there's generally less capability for democratic influence on those digital spaces. Users have less of a say in the rules and the behaviors of those systems. Now, of course, there is some user agency here. They do have some influence. One of the very clear points about capitalism is that you can always opt out of a system if it's heading in a direction you don't want. You can say, I don't like this product anymore, it's not suiting me, I can choose to go with a competitor. But some digital spaces now are becoming so large and so interwoven in our lives that they're almost becoming utilities. It can be quite a big request to say to a user in that situation, well, in that case, you need to withdraw from that service altogether. My point here is that because these spaces are largely under corporate control, it falls to people like you and me who work for these companies to create digital spaces that have positive impact for people. Because users don't always have such a strong say in how these spaces are created and how they evolve, we have to take their needs into account ourselves. We have to decide what a positive impact even means. And I think the idea of ethical thinking can help us to untangle that. One of the very clear themes that comes in digital work is the idea of scale at low cost. The impact of digital design can be significantly larger, disproportionately larger than it can be in many physical environments. So we take difficult decisions each day that affect thousands, millions, or even, in some cases, billions of users. Now that's kind of appealing, I think. Designers enjoy working at that kind of scale. We like having that knowledge of the human impact that we're having. And also, I'll admit, there's a certain sort of ego-stroking thrill about knowing that your work will be used by so many people. But there are some difficulties with this. Largely, these are unfathomable numbers. We're really not good at handling scale of that magnitude. Humans, we're much better at face-to-face interactions, one-to-one relationships with kids, lovers, parents, that kind of thing. When it comes to groups, that's harder. When it comes to communities, societies, and populations, we're really not geared for that kind of thinking. So that means that when we operate at scale, there's a tendency to let people become statistics. So let's say, for instance, if Facebook were to run an experiment with 1% of their user base, which I'm sure they do plenty of that kind of stuff, that 1% will equate to 10 or 11 million users in that single percent. That's obviously larger than the population of London. So when you're working with these kind of huge numbers, I think it's important that we find a way to honor the individual stories within those, not lose sight of the human impact of what we're doing. Imagine a user in that 10 million bracket who loses access to precious photos that mean a lot to them because you've made a change to the navigation or you've taken some functionality away, or whatever it is. So we need to find a way to aggregate to bring together the aggregate data, the statistical data of mass behavior with the small-scale qualitative feedback that people are telling us. And then how do we balance those priorities? It's an important question for us. Let's say we make a change, and of our million users, 90% like that change, pretty happy with it, 10% test it. Well, is that a net positive or a net negative interaction? I think one of the reasons that scale is so appealing to us is it almost takes us into a utopian vision of global citizenry, that essentially we're all one cosmopolitan group. One of the core ideas behind cosmopolitanism is that we are collectively responsible for each other's well-being. I think that's a really powerful idea, but for that to work, we have to understand that not everyone is the same, because with scale comes diversity. In the physical realm, we talk about accessibility of cities and building facilities for everyone, including those less physically able. In the digital world, we face similar challenges. I think we have big questions to ask about who can enjoy our digital spaces. I think it's tempting to look at accessibility sometimes and consider it either a bit of a nuisance or potentially even worse, a solved problem. We can regard it too much as an engineering technique. Slap some ARIA roles on, make sure your Images have alt text and all this sort of stuff. But I think accessibility is really, at its heart, a design and an ethical challenge. Still very much current, and it should be current in our thinking. When we consider accessibility, for me, what we're doing is taking a value judgment. We're asking who is worthy of our effort. In fact, we're asking who do we consider human? So I think it's important that we start to reframe accessibility not as a solved problem, but as a core issue of social justice. To be blunt, if today you're creating an application knowingly that is inaccessible to people, then you are consciously contributing to the repression of disabled people. Now, of course, there are laws, and obviously you'll do your best to adhere to those laws, but I think it's essential that ethics can take us beyond that. So one key role of ethics, I think, is to help convince business that it's not just about what's good for return on investment. And there is good ROI, of course, for accessible design and development, but it's not just about the return on investment there. I think it's also about what's our duty, what is right. It's about how do we bring qualities like compassion, inclusivity, and love to our businesses. Accessibility also goes, I think, beyond physical and mental capabilities. It also involves designing for people who are more diverse than us, perhaps in this room. We don't want to make lazy assumptions, for instance, about people's technical capabilities. We don't want to assume everyone's running on 4G networks, top-end handsets. If we take that decision to design exclusively for those people, then we isolate people who are not like us, mostly who are not rich and Western people. Are we comfortable with taking that kind of stance? Don't people deserve our best efforts, even though they may be a little bit less likely to be highly profitable for the companies that hire us? Another ethical crunch point I think that we need to consider is the idea of persuasion. Persuasion is an incredibly important tool for design. It helps designers achieve a number of goals. One of the groups of people that we try to persuade is, of course, stakeholders internally. This is really a question of how we present our work, how we present our advice and our suggestions, and how we pursue influence in our organizations. The user experience industry, I think, has historically taken quite a scientific stance to persuasion. And that scientific approach is somewhat valid when it comes to some techniques. Usability testing, for instance, yes, it will reduce the risk associated with your approach. It's going to improve, hopefully, the accuracy of what you're likely to deliver. But I do question whether the user experience field is as scientific as it claims. For me, it doesn't really meet the criteria of the scientific method. It's hard to quantify, it isn't replicable, so something that works in situation A is pretty much guaranteed not to work, actually, in situation B. It's so contextual, there really isn't that kind of objectivity that you seek in science. So I think we enter very dangerous territory when we start to overstate the rigor that design offers. Particularly, I see designers tend to oversell things like neuroscience. I have a rule of thumb that when I read a blog post, for instance, that talks about your brain, I tend to disregard it. I tend not to trust it. We also talk with undue justification around discredited ideas. For instance, I'm sure you've all heard of the golden ratio. The golden ratio, 1.618, root 5 minus 1 over 2. Is this harmonious proportion, temples and snails, spirals, and all these sorts of things key off that. Well, actually, there's no evidence that the golden ratio is in any way more harmonious or more pleasing to the human brain than any other arbitrary ratio between, say, 1 and 2. Yet I see the golden ratio used as a justification for design in all sorts of places that it's not merited. So I think we need to question, are these scientific associations really to our advantage? What role do they play for us? Are they really there to build trust in the things that we are proposing, or instead are they there to mythologize our craft? Is it really about building a wall of esoteric legitimacy and keeping others at a distance away from our territory? I actually think it's probably a bit of both. So the ethical designer for me is one who is aware of these issues. She can speak with honesty about the rigor that she brings to her work. I find the better the designer, the less categorical her language is. She calls it a hunch. She leaves that headroom for certainty when required. Another area where we use the persuasion toolkit is, of course, when we're talking with customers. Now, all design is persuasive by its nature. But of late, I think we're seeing more of a focus on what's sometimes called discursive technology. So this is technology that asks users questions about their life, about their behaviors. And hopefully the goal there is to change those behaviors for the positive. And there are some really strong and compelling applications of that. Getting people to think more intelligently about their health, their finance, that sort of thing. Potentially a very good thing for us all. But we do have to be extremely careful with persuasion because it is a successful technique and it is prone to murkier applications. One way we sometimes see persuasion manifesting is in the language we use. Something I call experiencization. It's kind of a clumsy title, but you'll recognize it from advertising. You'll never see an advert for a film anymore. You always see an advert for the movie event of the year. User experience designers, we do this too. We say things like, well, users don't buy products, they buy experiences. Or they buy better versions of themselves. And I can understand that language, I can understand that rhetoric, and sometimes it is indeed true. And it obviously lends more credibility to what the user experience designer is saying. But sometimes people just buy a spade, not the experience of digging. There is a risk that we are adding to this kind of cognitive inflation. We're making these functional, basic items appear like these magnificent lifestyle enrichers. It's a pretty ugly and dirty trick, to be honest. We criticize it when we see it in advertising, but yet we adopt exactly the same mentality when we talk about user experience design. One further concern I have about persuasion is, if we are to be ethical, persuasion should also be in the user's interests. And again, some applications are clear-cut. Losing weight, for instance, would be a good one. But really, who are we to determine the user's interest? And since we're for hire, doesn't that compromise our neutrality? Does that make us ethical relativists? Does that mean that we choose essentially whatever behavior we want to reward based on who's paying our paycheck that month? What checks and balances are in place for that situation? At its worst, I think persuasion can simply become a case of exploiting human weakness to sell more stuff. Of course we need to sell stuff. Those of us who work in the private sector, that's why we're hired. We're hired to make money for the people who hire us. And I don't think you can really question the ethics of that without going all the way up the chain and questioning the ethics of capitalism itself. But there are ethical questions in how we earn money for our bosses. One notable thing about capitalism is it tends to reward short-term priorities. Big red lines going up and to the right, growth, stock prices, relatively short-term things. Are these really the right measures for our society? One example of this would be gross domestic product, GDP, which you've all heard of. Economists love this measure. They spend a lot of time tracking it. Politicians also like this measure. They expend a lot of energy trying to increase that metric. And GDP is an accurate measure of economic activity. But I'm concerned that doesn't really correlate necessarily with what is good. So one fairly daft example here is a car crash increases GDP. Someone's got to come and fix your car, they've got to replant the tree you knocked over, that kind of thing. But teaching your child to recycle, that's probably not going to have any short-term impact. Businesses tend to take what's known as a logical positivist mindset, which is they think the only meaningful statements are the ones that they can observe to be true. For designers, that's quite a tricky thing, because a lot of the outcomes of design, the things that we try and aim for, they're intangible. Loyalty, trust, credibility. These things resist measurement. You can't weigh love. So designers have to find a way to reconcile that dissonance. How can we present these intangible outcomes in ways that appeal to the positivist mindset of business? And there are a couple of ways that we can handle this. The most common is we find a way. We look at a way to translate this intangible thing to a dollar value or to some return on investment or something like that, with varying levels of success. To be honest, there are some fairly spurious attempts to do that. Another way is to try and reverse it, is to educate the business and say, yes, I understand you're chasing the bottom line, but look at the value these intangibles bring. Look at the increase in loyalty, net promoter score, customer loyalty, and so on. Now, that's my preferred way of working. But I can tell you from experience it's pretty difficult because you've got to change the mindset of a whole heap of people. Another way we reconcile that difference is sometimes we just get tired and we give up. And what happens there is this is the road to dark patterns. Dark patterns are designs that trick users to behave in ways that are advantageous to us, but disadvantageous to them. Now, in theory, these are clearly unethical, but like all of these discussions, it's not quite black and white. One of the things we have to do is say, well, what does disadvantageous mean here? One example, which has actually now recently been outlawed, I believe, is if you're buying something on an e-commerce site, we used to see a lot of sites throw in something extra. So you might buy a flight and they put in insurance, pre-checked go in, or an extended warranty if you're buying a stereo, something like that. I'm fairly comfortable in saying that that's just flat out unethical. However, there'll be someone in the organization who made a compelling argument, convinced enough people that, but what if it breaks? That person's going to be thrilled that we gave them that extended warranty. Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken it. Now, later in the talk, I'm going to talk about some principles for examining the ethical integrity of an argument. One that doesn't work, as a bit of a freebie, is what's known as the dirty hands argument. That essentially says, well, everyone else does it, and if we don't, someone else is going to. It doesn't stand up to any kind of ethical analysis. Just because something is widespread doesn't make it right. Cheating on your spouse, racism, speeding, these things are fairly commonplace. That doesn't mean they're morally correct. Now, with dark patterns, there will be some clear negative repercussions. You'll probably have brand toxicity, you might have class action lawsuits, that kind of thing against you. But until regulation really kind of kicks in, it falls to designers, it falls to regular people inside companies to try and combat these things where they happen. And that needs eternal vigilance. We've got to be on our toes all the time. Because companies that tend to come up with this stuff tend to be the companies that have flawed value systems. Tends to mean that this sort of thing, you can kill it a few times and it'll just keep cropping up. But it's not an easy debate. You might find, for instance, that a company has done the analysis. They recognize the downsides, the harm to loyalty and brand and reputation, but they also recognize that the profit exceeds all of that. So that's a tricky one to argue. Or what if you see something happening that's not under your direct control, somewhere else in the organization? How do you go tackling these issues? What if you're told you do this or you lose your job? Do corporate pressures amount to diminish responsibility? It takes a hell of a lot of determination to argue against some of those challenges. I also want to talk about disruption. One of the things we've seen very clearly over the last maybe 10, 20 years is that technology kills the middleman. We've seen this mostly in media, video stores, newspapers, this kind of thing. But we're starting to see this creep into other verticals as well, into lending, taxi services, hotels, and so on. Is disruption a positive thing? We frequently assume it is, and I think if you read a lot of the tech press, it's taken as a given that disruption is a positive change. And it may well be. But if we say that, I think we do have to recognize the politics inherent within that belief. Sometimes I think we laugh at the subjects of our disruption. These are enemies of progress. It's just, it's unlucky, but they become obsolete, they become irrelevant. But the truth is that disruption often hurts low-paid service workers the most. It creates unemployment, it shrinks their hiring capabilities, it shrinks their wages. And instead, it offers gains in convenience for the rich, the middle classes. So if we're not careful, disruption can actually become a vector for inequality, a flow from labor to capital. Disruption is sometimes used as well to mean essentially selectively ignoring certain laws, inconvenient laws. We don't often talk about how those laws are sometimes there for consumer protection. We believe that's an anti-progressive discussion to be having. But I think the ethical designer has a real duty to consider these issues. And then, of course, we come to the most pressing ethical issue of modern times. I think we all know the severity of the environmental problem we face. Recent reports from the IPCC and so on have said that the impact of climate change is now severe, pervasive, and irreversible. During my research for this talk, I came across an idea from Slavoj Žižek, who's a philosopher. And it kind of stuck with me. And he says that oil was essentially the result of a planetary catastrophe. Something, the asteroid came down or whatever it was, and wiped out life on Earth, and it all broke down into a convenient flammable fluid. And then, blind to the irony of that situation, we're potentially using that same fluid to bring about another potential catastrophe. This quote by Victor Papanek, I think, sums up designers' role in climate change. There are professions more harmful than industrial design, but only a very few of them. Designers have directly contributed to climate change. It's we who've created the gas guzzlers, the poisoners, the pollutants, the landfill. I think it's right that we shoulder some of the blame for the future, and for some that future looks fairly bleak. How can we respond to that? Can we redeem ourselves? I'm not sure. I'm not overly optimistic, but I think we have to try. I personally believe that the main purpose for design over the next 50 years is to help humans survive the subsequent 50. It's tempting to think that we digital folk are off the hook. You know, we deal in bits and pixels and electrons rather than waste and landfill and so on. Yeah, there's something in that, but I think we can't squirm out of it quite so easily. For one, the tech industry pursues some of the most aggressive upgrade cycles in consumer goods. Think about how many devices over the last 10 years you've bought and subsequently passed on or thrown away. And we're complicit in this. We say that to create the best experiences, we need the best hardware. We have to target the top-end devices. And that, of course, causes people to buy the latest stuff. Is fantastic user experience really worth that landfill and environmental degradation? Are we comfortable being the agents of obsolescence? One other point is, of course, everything we do runs on electricity. Electricity we think of as invisible. It feels like air. But of course, we know that behind the scenes, it's the same old fossil fuels that are mostly used to create that stuff. It just hides that damage upstream where we can claim not to have any impact on it. More subtly, I think there are issues around sustainability here. Sustainability isn't just about conserving manufacturing resources. It's also about making things that last, which means that that whole manufacturing cycle is called into play less frequently. You're probably aware of the Future Friendly campaign. This is a campaign essentially for sustainable digital product design. In essence, it says that if you design for a diverse set of devices, that means people can, A, hang on to their older devices, which means, again, less of this kind of landfill, less of this upgrade cycle. It also means we can anticipate what's next. That means less rework of the things we do. It means businesses start to appreciate that sustainability can be good for business as well. I think there's an important ethical question that we can try and introduce to our companies. So hopefully I've convinced you there are some areas of our work that do demand greater ethical attention. So how do we train ourselves to think in this way? Now, I did say at the start there are no easy answers, but there are some principles that we can turn to. I think just like design principles, I like to consider these as guiding stars that can help steer me through uncertain territory. The first one is simply to think. The person who is certain of his conduct is the most dangerous of all. Meanwhile, the responsible person is the one who thinks he's never been responsible enough. Examining our actions takes a lot of courage. It leads us to kind of uncomfortable places, and that's great. That means we're getting to the heart of these ethical questions. So I think we have a duty to recognize tough decisions in our work and pause, to give them the respect and the time that they deserve. Am I sure that this is the right course of action? What might be the implications for others? Who might it benefit? Who might it harm? How can I try and mitigate that damage? It's so easy to skip this step, particularly if we're in a position of advantage. But the choice to not pause and consider our beliefs and our actions, that is itself a moral decision. If you do stop and think, I think you might find the answer surprising. It might cause you to question your beliefs, your values, even what you consider to be common sense. This quote from Mike Monteiro, that unethical design happens not due to malicious intent, but with no intent at all. Every now and then, discussion of ethics kind of converges on the idea of codifying conduct. You know, all we need is like a code of ethics or a Hippocratic oath for design. I've never found these campaigns that convincing. Because for me, ethics requires fluidity of thinking. Codes are very specific, they're very narrow, and they easily become slogans. And slogans are dangerous. Slogans are slippery, they're seductive, they sound right, they look right when you first see them. You nod your head and go, oh yes, that's quite profound. But they lack nuance, they lack context, the very things that lie at the heart of ethics. One example which you potentially familiar with is the idea that, well, if you're not paying for something, then you are the product. Now, I will confess I have significant bias in this argument. It's free to use the service that I design day in, day out. But is that statement actually valid, or is it a slogan? Essentially, the implication is that all business that you don't pay for is unethical. That would then have to cover quite a wide variety of verticals. It would cover some newspapers, it would cover buskers, bloggers, social networks, TV channels, search engines, financial advisors, comparison websites. Are we saying by extension that all of those are unethical? We also have to recognize, for example, the politics of that statement. If the only wholesome business model is one where the end user pays for something, I worry that's rather exclusionary of the poor, of the developing world, of children, of people with no credit cards, and so on. What matters, of course, is the detail, is the value exchange. What are you giving? What are you getting in return? What protections are in place? And that outcome for the user can be positive and it can be negative, for sure. The point is that sloganeering is not helpful. It demonstrates to me a lack of ethical thought. It's a blanket morality applied without a consideration of context. That kind of lack of mindfulness can be very harmful. So I think that if we learn to distrust the easy catchphrase, the easy slogan, I think we become more aware people. Another useful technique I'd like to share is the idea to try and universalize our thinking. So by that I mean think about our conduct in the context of wider society. One way to look at this is, what would happen to the world if everyone did what I'm doing right now? Would that world, where my action is commonplace, would that be a better world or a worse world? It can be quite a good rule of thumb for ethical thinking. To an extent, that's practicing the principle of utilitarianism, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. Essentially, that's a belief that we should judge an action based on how much happiness it offers or how much it avoids unhappiness and pain. It's still a fairly highly regarded topic in ethical thinking with, albeit some limitations. There's another principle that I tend to return to quite a lot, which also talks about universalizing our actions. This is from Immanuel Kant. Treat humanity never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. It takes a bit of unpacking that. So I read that really as respect that every single person has worth. You can't do something, you can't take any action without regard for the individual stories within that. We have to treat people as beings with their own goals and work with them so we all get closer. We can't simply use people to achieve our own ends. And I think this is the closest thing I've seen to a guiding principle for ethical conduct. It addresses ideas of scale and disruption and persuasion and ensuring that users get a fair deal from the things that we create. I find it a really helpful formulation to guide the work that I do daily. Another idea that I think is potentially really powerful is, would you put your name on a decision you've made? In the background here, you'll see a few signatures. These are the signatures that were embossed inside the case of the original Mac. The team who'd worked on the Mac was so happy, was so proud of the machine they'd made, that they took the time to all sign some plate and actually print it on the inside of every single Mac. So if you upgraded it, you'd see people sign their name to the machine. How much of your work are you prepared to put your name to? How much of my work am I? In this era where the idea of the MVP, the minimum viable product, is definitely in the ascendancy, how much rushed work do we do? How much good enough or half-assed work is there? Would you want people, strangers, not fellow designers, we know too much about how the sausage is made, but people on the outside, would you want them to know that you made that decision that they're using or they're struggling with or they're enjoying right now? We can extend that concept not just to strangers, but to future generations as well. This is something that's known as the grandchild test. Would you be comfortable explaining your actions today to your grandkids in, 40 years? I think, we can look back at history and we can be fairly appalled at some of the things that happened, slavery and witch burning and all this sort of stuff. Now, hopefully, our sins won't be as great as that, but will our grandchildren feel that we acted correctly when it came to the environment, for instance, or issues of social justice? Finally, I think it's important that we complete the circle. So if we stop, if we pause to think about the ethical implications of the decisions we make every day, if we learn to distrust slogans and go deeper to understand the context and the nuance, if we consider universalizing our actions to see what the world would be like if they were more commonplace, and then if we hopefully take a decision we're confident in and that we would be prepared to sign our name to, if we've done all those things, then I think we have to finish up by talking about what we learned. And this is obviously my intent today. I think it is about time that we started to talk seriously about the issue of ethics. We need to find colleagues and peers who are interested in this topic too. There are people who are committed to doing the right thing out there, sometimes even in the places that get the worst press. We need to embrace and cherish these people. They'll nourish our efforts in return. So I hope in my small way I've inspired you to start talking and sharing thoughts with others, maybe blog posts or talks or maybe even ethics committees within your industry or even your workplace. I think by doing this we can encourage others to examine the ethical issues in their own work, and then that means that the previously invisible will eventually become blinding.